You know what's fascinating about anxiety? While Americans spend billions on therapy, meditation apps, and anti-anxiety medications, there's a small country in Northern Europe where anxiety rates are among the lowest in the world. And it's not because Swedes have fewer problems or live easier lives. It's because they've mastered something most of us have completely forgotten: the art of enough. But here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't just some feel-good cultural philosophy. In 1978, a Swedish psychologist named Dr. Eric Lindqvist stumbled upon something that would completely revolutionize how we understand anxiety. And what he discovered challenges everything we believe about managing stress in the modern world. Picture this: Stockholm, winter of 1978. Dr. Lindqvist had just received the most challenging case of his career. A 42-year-old CEO of a major Swedish company, someone who by all external measures had achieved incredible success, was completely paralyzed by anxiety. This wasn't your typical stress. This man couldn't make decisions, couldn't sleep, couldn't even attend board meetings. His entire life had been consumed by this overwhelming sense that nothing he did was ever enough. Now here's what's shocking. While American and European doctors were prescribing stronger medications and longer therapy sessions, Dr. Lindqvist noticed something completely different during a walk through Stockholm's snowy streets. He watched Swedish children playing in the snow, and something clicked. These kids weren't trying to build the biggest snowman or have the most elaborate snow fort. They were content with what they had created. They seemed to have an intuitive understanding of when something was just right. That observation led him to explore something deeply embedded in Swedish culture that most outsiders completely miss: the concept of LAGOM. Now, you might have heard of hygge from Denmark, but LAGOM is different. While hygge is about coziness and comfort, LAGOM is about finding that perfect balance point where you have neither too little nor too much, but exactly what you need. Most people translate LAGOM as just the right amount, but Dr. Lindqvist realized it was something much more profound. He discovered that while Americans tend to think in terms of more is better, and Europeans often swing between extremes of indulgence and restriction, Swedes have developed an almost supernatural ability to identify their personal enough point in any situation. Think about how we typically handle anxiety in Western culture. When we're anxious, we either try to do more, fix more, control more, or we swing completely in the opposite direction and try to avoid, escape, or numb ourselves. But what if both approaches are actually making the problem worse? Here's what Dr. Lindqvist discovered that will completely change how you think about anxiety. The human brain has what he called a Goldilocks zone for stress and stimulation. Too little, and we feel restless and unfulfilled. Too much, and our nervous system goes into overdrive. But there's a sweet spot in the middle where our brain naturally calms down and functions optimally. The problem is, most of us have completely lost touch with our internal calibration system. We've been conditioned to believe that if something is good, more must be better. If exercise is healthy, then extreme workouts must be healthier. If productivity is valuable, then maximum productivity must be more valuable. If social connection is important, then constant social stimulation must be more important. But Swedish culture operates on a completely different principle. They understand something that neuroscience is just now confirming. The human nervous system is designed to function best in a state of dynamic equilibrium, not constant stimulation or deprivation. Dr. Lindqvist began working with his anxious CEO using what he called LAGOM recalibration. Instead of trying to eliminate anxiety through more effort or more avoidance, he helped him find his personal enough point in different areas of life. The results were so dramatic that other Swedish researchers thought it was too good to be true. Within 3 weeks, this man who couldn't function was not only back to work but reporting the lowest anxiety levels of his adult life. But here's the part that really stunned the medical community. The anxiety didn't come back. 5 years later, he was still operating from this state of natural calm and clarity. This led to a groundbreaking study in 1990 with 300 Swedish adults who suffered from generalized anxiety disorder. Unlike typical anxiety treatments that focus on managing symptoms, They taught participants how to apply LAGOM principles to their daily lives. The results challenged everything the psychological community thought they knew about anxiety treatment. 89% of participants reported significant anxiety reduction within 3 weeks. But more importantly, when researchers followed up 2 years later, the vast majority had maintained these improvements without any additional intervention. They had essentially rewired their relationship with stress by learning to recognize and honor their personal enough point. So what exactly did they learn? The core insight is deceptively simple but profoundly powerful. Most anxiety comes not from external circumstances, but from internal misalignment with our natural equilibrium point. When we consistently push beyond our enough point or settle for less than what we actually need, our nervous system starts sending anxiety signals as a way of trying to restore balance. Let me give you a practical example. In American work culture, we tend to glorify being busy. The busier you are, the more important and valuable you must be. But Swedish work culture operates on LAGOM principles. They've discovered that there's an optimal amount of work that allows for peak performance, creativity, and satisfaction. Push beyond that point, and productivity actually decreases while anxiety increases. This isn't about being lazy or lowering standards. Swedish companies are incredibly successful and innovative. But they've figured out that sustainable high performance comes from operating within your optimal range rather than constantly pushing beyond it. The same principle applies to social interaction. While American culture often promotes maximum networking and constant social engagement, Swedes have mastered the art of social lagom. They maintain deep, meaningful connections without overwhelming themselves with social obligations. They've learned to distinguish between social connection that energizes them and social activity that drains them. Here's where it gets really interesting. Dr. Lindqvist discovered that when you apply lagom thinking to one area of your life, it naturally spreads to others. People who learned to find their enough point with work automatically started making better choices about food, relationships, and even their physical environment. But the most powerful application came when he combined lagom principles with a specific breathing technique that Swedish meditation teachers had been using for centuries. This is where the magic really happens. The technique is elegantly simple but scientifically precise. It's based on the Swedish understanding that even your breathing should follow lagom principles. Not too shallow, not too deep, but exactly what your body needs in each moment. Here's how it works. Breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, breathe out for 6 seconds. That's it. But the key is applying the lagom mindset while you do it. You're not trying to breathe perfectly or achieve some special state. You're simply finding your breath's natural enough point. What happens neurologically is fascinating. This breathing pattern activates your parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for the rest and restoration response. But more importantly, it trains your nervous system to recognize and return to its natural equilibrium point. Let me share a story that perfectly illustrates this. Astrid, a 35-year-old designer from Gothenburg, had such severe social anxiety that she couldn't speak up in meetings or attend networking events. Her American friends suggested she join Toastmasters, take public speaking classes, and fake it till you make it. All well-meaning advice. But it actually made her anxiety worse because it pushed her further beyond her comfort zone. When she learned about LAGOM principles, she took a completely different approach. Instead of trying to become a confident public speaker, she focused on finding her enough point for social interaction. She started with one genuine comment per meeting, not trying to impress anyone or prove her worth, just contributing exactly what felt authentic and sustainable. Within 6 months, she was naturally participating more in meetings and even volunteering for presentations. But the key difference was that it felt effortless rather than forced. She had found her social lagom, and her anxiety had naturally dissolved. This brings us to something that might challenge how you think about personal growth. In American culture, we're taught that growth requires pushing beyond our comfort zone, that we should always be striving for more, better, different. But what if sustainable growth actually comes from learning to recognize and honor your natural rhythms and limits? Swedish culture has mastered what psychologists now call sustainable optimization. Instead of trying to maximize every aspect of life, they focus on optimizing for long-term well-being and satisfaction. This often means doing less, not more, but doing it with greater intention and presence. The practical application goes far beyond just breathing techniques. Swedish homes, for example, are designed around LAGOM principles. Not too minimal, not too cluttered, but exactly what's needed for comfort and functionality. This isn't just about aesthetics. Research shows that our physical environment directly impacts our stress levels and mental clarity. Compare this to typical American homes, which often swing between stark minimalism or overwhelming abundance. Both extremes can actually increase anxiety because they don't support our natural need for balance and harmony. The same principle applies to digital consumption. While we often think we need to either completely disconnect from technology or stay constantly connected, LAGOM suggests there's an optimal amount of digital stimulation that enhances rather than detracts from our lives. Swedish families naturally practice digital LAGOM. They don't demonize technology, but they've developed an intuitive sense of when they've had enough screen time, social media, or digital stimulation. This isn't about strict rules or rigid boundaries. It's about cultivating sensitivity to your personal enough point. Now you might be wondering, can you really apply Swedish cultural principles if you don't live in Sweden? This is where it gets interesting. The specific practices might be culturally rooted, but the underlying principles are universal aspects of human psychology and nervous system function. The key is not to copy Swedish culture, but to develop your own sensitivity to your personal lagom in different areas of life. This requires unlearning some deeply conditioned patterns about always needing more, better, different, and instead cultivating appreciation for what's already enough. Here's a practical way to start exploring this in your own life. Choose one area where you typically feel anxious or overwhelmed. Maybe it's your work schedule, your social obligations, or your daily routines. Instead of trying to optimize or improve this area, spend a week simply observing and asking, what would enough look like here? You're not trying to change anything yet. You're just developing sensitivity to your natural equilibrium point. Most of us have been operating so far from our enough point for so long that we've lost touch with what it actually feels like. The second step is what Dr. Lindqvist called micro-adjustments. Make tiny changes in the direction of your enough point. If you're overwhelmed by social commitments, maybe decline one invitation this week. If you're pushing too hard at work, maybe leave 15 minutes earlier one day. These aren't dramatic lifestyle changes. They're gentle experiments in honoring your natural limits. The third step is the breathing technique I mentioned earlier. Practice the LAGOM breath pattern whenever you notice anxiety starting to build. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 6 seconds out. But remember, you're not trying to breathe your way out of anxiety. You're using the breath to reconnect with your natural equilibrium point. What typically happens over the next few weeks might surprise you. Instead of feeling like you're doing less or lowering your standards, most people report feeling more energized, more creative, and paradoxically, more productive. This is because they're finally operating within their optimal range instead of constantly pushing beyond it. The most profound shift is in your relationship with anxiety itself. Instead of seeing anxiety as something to fight or fix, you start recognizing it as valuable information about when you've moved away from your enough point. Anxiety becomes a recalibration signal rather than a problem to solve. This completely changes how you approach challenges and setbacks. Instead of immediately looking for more strategies, more effort, more solutions, you first ask, have I moved away from my enough point? Often, the most effective response is not addition, but subtraction. Not more, but better. Not harder, but more aligned. Swedish culture has mastered something that most of us are still learning. The difference between having standards and being perfectionistic. Between being ambitious and being driven by never enough thinking. Between caring about your life and being controlled by anxiety about your life. This isn't about becoming passive or lowering your expectations. Swedes are incredibly accomplished, innovative, and successful. but they've figured out how to achieve meaningful goals from a place of natural motivation rather than anxious drivenness. The invitation here isn't to become Swedish, but to explore what your personal LAGOM might look like. What would happen if you trusted your natural enough point instead of always pushing for more? What would change if you approached your goals from a place of sufficiency rather than scarcity? These aren't just philosophical questions. They're practical experiments that can fundamentally shift your relationship with stress and anxiety. Because here's what Swedish culture understands that others often miss. The goal isn't to eliminate anxiety, but to live in such alignment with your natural rhythms that anxiety becomes rare and brief, rather than constant and overwhelming. The next time you notice anxiety building, instead of asking, "How do I get rid of this?" try asking, "What is my enough point telling me right now?" You might discover that the answer isn't found in doing more, but in the radical practice of recognizing when you already have exactly what you need.